Hello, property managers. Welcome to another episode of the Fair Housing Insiders. Today, we're going to be talking about something a little different this time, fair housing and resident discrimination. How can you protect your staff's rights? Stick around because we're going to dive right in. Hello, Fair Housing Insiders. We've got another episode for you today. And with us today is Fair Housing attorney Leslie Tucker. Leslie, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here as always, Michael.
Yeah. So I thought this was going to be an interesting topic because we're kind of flipping the script on ourselves here. Usually we are talking about residents' rights and discrimination towards residents, but that's not the direction we're going in today. So let's talk about when a resident discriminates against an employee. And I think we need to start with the people that sometimes get the most interactions with residents on a day-to-day basis. And really, they're one of the foundations of all property management, and that is maintenance employees. So obviously, this is all about the Fair Housing Act. That's what we talk about. Does the Fair Housing Act protect maintenance employees as actual employees in the property from discrimination from residents?
So a maintenance employee has the right to work in a discrimination-free workplace, as do all employees. But that right is not found under the Fair Housing Act. That right is found under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. This is the section of the Civil Rights Act that addresses employment discrimination, and comparing that with the Fair Housing Act, which is Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act. So it is technically a different section, but a lot of the rights are very much the same. So even though the Fair Housing Act wouldn't necessarily cover situations where residents may be discriminating against an employee, again, the basic rights are the same, and housing providers have an obligation to both their residents and their employees. And I should note, Michael, by the way, that in some properties, maintenance lives on site. A lot of times, these are kind of smaller communities where a maintenance employee and sometimes even the managers live on site. In those cases, the employees would have rights both as a resident and as an employee.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've lived in several properties where my maintenance managers were my neighbors. So, okay. All right. Well, I guess this helps us kind of, again, we talk about mostly all the Fair Housing Act here because that's what our expertise is. But I guess it is important for us to remember that sometimes our view can't be so narrow because while the Fair Housing Act, of course, applies on your property, there's a lot of laws that apply on your property, just like we're talking about this Title VII of the Civil Rights Act protecting your staff members. So I guess it's good to have that reminder that it's not just all about the residents. Staff have rights as well. Obviously we want to protect our staff's rights. And one great way to do that is to make sure that everybody stays trained. So make sure that you keep subscribing and watching these videos, hit that like button, ring that bell, stay subscribed, and keep your community engaged. All right, Leslie, what should property managers do if you kind of get in that nightmare scenario where a resident is just refusing services from a maintenance employee? They're not letting them in the room. They're not letting them do their work. And you have a strong reason to believe that refusal is based on their race, their sex, any of their protected categories.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for a resident to demand that certain staff members refrain from communicating with them or from entering their unit. Sometimes the resident may believe that a maintenance employee is rude. Maybe they just kind of don't like the way that they interact. Maybe a resident might believe a maintenance employee doesn't do a good job, doesn't complete the work properly, or something like that. And in those cases, sometimes it may be reasonable, and that's a big may. It may be reasonable to oblige the resident's demands if you have other maintenance staff available. If you have a large maintenance staff, if you have a maintenance staff of maybe 2, 3, or 4, and you just kind of take that one out of circulation from going into that resident's unit. If the resident's going to make things uncomfortable or hostile for a particular person on your staff, why force the issue if you don't have to?
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. It's like obviously from the employee that's getting the discrimination, it's like I'd be more than happy for my boss to tell me, it's like, you know what, you don't have to go to that person's room who doesn't like you and doesn't want to interact with you. While you may not agree with what they're doing or why they're doing it, it's probably a lot more work and a lot more hassle for the staff to just go through that motion of back and forth rather than just be like, you know what, we're going to send somebody else so that we can just move on because everybody's got a lot to deal with in that job. Probably got 100 other rooms to deal with today. Why just focus on her?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just about operations, getting things done. However, kind of as you asked me earlier, sometimes these demands are not about, personality differences or workmanship. Sometimes it's pretty obvious that residents are, prohibiting certain employees into their unit because of a protected category, because of their race or sex or national origin, something like that. So in those situations, I see kind of two issues. The first is, has the resident made any statements to that employee about these protected categories? In other words, has the resident already subjected that employee to some type of illegal harassment or discrimination? If so, that's a blatant violation of your lease, and certainly warrants some action. So that could be a strongly worded letter. That could be an in-person meeting. It could be a lease violation. Whatever it is, the resident needs to be advised immediately in writing that that type of behavior won't be tolerated, just as sort of in an initial response. The second issue I see is the resident refusing to permit entry entirely? Because they don't like a particular resident? Are they closing off their unit entirely? Regardless of the reason, if a resident is refusing entry for an inspection, for maintenance work, whatever you need to do as a housing provider, that's also a violation of the lease. And it doesn't really matter what the resident, what reason the resident is giving. You have a right as a housing provider, and not only a right, but an obligation to enter residents' units to do work and to do inspections. So, I guess to sum all that up, a resident's bias is never a justifiable reason to oblige their request to pick and choose which maintenance staff goes into their unit. However, protecting your employees from potential harassment or discrimination, it may justify altering your policies a little bit, potentially moving employees around. Your residents don't get to dictate who is on your maintenance staff. They just don't. And to the extent that they try to, however they do that, you as a housing provider need to hold those residents accountable for any actions that they take that may violate your rules.
Yeah, I've got to imagine that's kind of a frustrating thing to go through because you have to deal with, I would imagine this resident might be causing a few other problems as well on top of this. And they have to deal with somebody doing these discriminatory actions and statements towards your employees when you're just trying to get work done. This is why I'm glad we're talking about this is because we're talking about protecting employees. Specifically in this case, we're talking about protecting maintenance employees. That's why we want to share this knowledge. That's why we want everyone trained. And I have to, of course, recommend one of the best ways to protect your maintenance employees is to make sure they're trained as well. So they should see this video as well and make sure they check out our Fair Housing and Maintenance Professionals course on fairhousinginstitute.com. Again, to make sure they understand what they can and can't say, what their rights are and what the residents' rights are. So let's try to actually get this down into like a little quick list. So let's look at policies and best practices to try to avoid this becoming a bigger problem than it already is. So what best practices can property managers throw out there, implement on their properties and their operations to ensure that maintenance staff has a good, fair, respectful work environment, that they don't have to worry about all this discrimination and harassment?
Yeah. So I think I would recommend two kind of basic policies surrounding this whole issue. The first policy should always be a absolute zero tolerance for discriminatory treatment and harassment. And I know that many of you, and hopefully all of you, have policies that protect your residents from that type of treatment, from other residents and from employees. And they generally kind of know that this is their right. It's in your lease. It's in your house rules. So that is usually part of your policies. But making sure that the addition of the prohibition to harass your employees as well is in your policies. A maintenance employee, may not be fazed by someone who's rude, by someone who calls them names. That may not bother them. It may just roll off their back. But maintenance employees should be aware of the difference between someone who's being rude, someone who's short with them, and someone who's actually subjecting them to discriminatory behavior and discriminatory treatment. So them kind of recognizing the difference and knowing when to report it to management and when to just sort of let it roll off their back. That's really important. The second policy that I think that I would certainly recommend is a requirement that if a resident demands that a certain maintenance employee not enter their unit, they don't want them there, they are not going to allow them in. If you must continue to send that employee into the unit because maybe you have a very small staff, you don't have anyone else to send, you have to send this person to their unit to do their work. If you must continue to send that person should only enter the unit if there is a second staff person present. And I say that because in lawsuits and in complaints, a lot of these situations are he said, she said. And having a witness present for any interaction going forward is absolutely crucial and really defends both your company and that employee from these types of unwarranted complaints going forward. So those are kind of the two most important ones that I see.
That makes a lot of sense, Leslie. I think one thing I would probably add on top of this, if our listeners didn't pull it away enough, is that this sounds like really important cornerstone of all this would be communication with your staff, making sure they understand what's acceptable and what's not. Because you said maybe these staff members are just brushing things off and they consider it part of their job, when the truth is they're being discriminated against. And you don't have to tolerate it. The maintenance employee doesn't have to tolerate it. You don't have to tolerate it as a manager or property owner. So make sure you're talking to your staff about what they are experiencing out in the field, and make sure that this isn't already a potential problem that's going on so that you can get ahead of it right now. Leslie, thank you again so much for talking about this. I feel like this is a pretty important topic because we're talking about protecting employees. So I really appreciate you joining us again today. And I appreciate our community out there for listening to our episodes, for sharing them with your staff, with your community. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. We've got more episodes on important topics like this coming out every couple of weeks. So stay informed, stay in the know. Thanks again. This has been another episode of the Fair Housing Insiders. Come back and see us. Happy training.